In 2 Corinthians 11, and we noticed as we finished Paul's discussion on the gift that he was collecting and giving in general in chapters 8 and 9, he then in the rest of this book now is really, and while he's done so in bits and pieces throughout the book, he is really honing in on his defense of the charges that are being brought by these false teachers, Judaizing teachers most likely, and defending his apostleship and his character really. And so as we got into chapter 11, you notice the difference, of course, between he and these fellows is that, he mentions, first of all, he likens himself as a father who is giving his virgin daughter, pure daughter in marriage to Christ. That's the way he represented his relationship to this Corinthian church. After all, he was the one that established the church there. But notice, as he describes these fellows, he mentions words like craftiness, whereas if you go down to verse 6, when he talks about himself, he talks about being manifested among you in all things. In other words, the difference is being open. He was always open and honest with these people, whereas these other fellows were crafty, they were cunning, they were deceptive, just like Satan. And we mentioned there and I think we stopped there about verse 7, but we mentioned verse 5 last week. There's a difference of opinion in that translation there, for I consider that I'm not at all inferior to the most eminent apostles. And there's really two ways to look at that. Paul, and really either way is true. First of all, Paul's credentials, he was not inferior to any of the real of the 12, we might say, the original apostles. He didn't come behind them in anything, he said on one occasion. And that's true, and he had just as much authority as they had. And yet, some translators say that this word in the Greek can be translated, in fact, I think maybe one modern translation uses the word super apostles. I'm not behind any of these super apostles, perhaps indicating some sarcasm in that he might not be referring to the original 12 at all, but he might be referring to these false apostles, these false teachers who are holding themselves out as something there that have come into the Corinthian church to stir up these problems. Either way, he's certainly not inferior to them either. And we see some more of that kind of, if you look down, we'll see how he describes these fellows. And so maybe that is one way to look at it. It's hard to say for sure. But he points out that he's untrained in speech, but not in knowledge. Obviously, Paul wasn't considered one of those great Greek orators of the day. And yet when he spoke with authority, and he spoke the Word of God. So let's pick up there in about verse 7. Did I commit sin in humbling myself that you might be exalted? Let me stop right there for a minute. I think the King James says offense, but that's not. It's kind of weird, but that word there, hamartia, is translated 174 times in the New Testament, and only here does it, for some reason, the King James translators chose the word offense. But in every other instance, 173 times, it's translated what? Sin, which is the correct translation here. Did I commit sin? The New King James says, did I commit sin in humbling myself that you might be exalted, because I preach the gospel of God to you free of charge? I robbed, and this is metaphorically, of course, I robbed other churches, taking wages from them to minister to you. And when I was present with you and in need, I was a burden to no one. For what I lacked, the brethren who came from Macedonia supplied. And in everything I kept myself from being burdensome to you, And so I will keep myself as the truth of Christ is in me. No one shall stop me from this boasting in the regions of Achaia. Why? Because I do not love you? God knows. Well, again, in defending himself, he's caught in this situation where it's very possible, and we don't know for sure, perhaps sometime in his past, Paul had been run into somebody that had maybe leveled some accusations about money. I don't know. We don't know that for sure, but for whatever reason. And maybe just Paul saw in these people, I mean, look at 1 Corinthians. These people had a lot of problems, and they had a lot of attitude issues. And so maybe he just saw in these people that I don't want to get into this situation. He had enough confidence in the Macedonian brethren in Philippi and other places in Macedonia to take money from them. In fact, that was kind of his usual mode of operation, was to do what? You establish a church, you preach the gospel, you help save these people, and then what's their obligation as you move on to new areas where the gospel's never been taken? Well, then you allow them to share in that work and to support you, and that was kind of his general mode. But for whatever reason, he wouldn't take money from the Corinthians, and maybe we can see why with all their issues. But again, you run into a catch-22 as far as these false teachers are concerned and his critics are concerned, because they use it as kind of a source of strain or tension between them and Paul. Because had Paul taken money, what would these guys have said? Had Paul taken money from them, they would have said what? Well, you're just in it for the money. And Paul says, well, I'm not going to take the money. Well, if you don't take the money, and we know you have authority, and you've already laid this out in other epistles, right? We know that you have the authority and the right to take the money. So if you don't take the money, then that means what? No. You don't have authority. You're not who you say you are. Because if you were, you would take the money, right? If you had the right to take the money, you'd take the money. So you're not taking the money. So either way, it's going to be an issue. I mean, that's kind of what we see in politics. I mean, that's really just politics at its core. And so they're going to attack him for whatever course he takes. You either are not worthy of support, or that's all you're in it for. And so, and it's interesting too, because, we sometimes think today, well, travel, look, travel in that day was expensive. They didn't, we think it's expensive, and it is today, can be. Depending on what mode you take. But these guys, if you're walking, let's say you walk across the Turkish peninsula, modern day Turkey, on a missionary trip. You walk 20 miles a day, 700 miles. Is that going to cost you some money, to live? So, he could use the support. So anyway, for whatever reason, these people are a little bit confused, I guess, by his refusal, and these other fellows are using it against him. After all, if a plumber or electrician showed up at your house and did some work and you said, hey, let me pay you, and he said, it's gratis. It's on the house, free of charge. What would you think? What's wrong with this guy? Something's up, right? Maybe that's kind of the way some of them thought. But Paul was doing it to avoid some appearance of impropriety, and frankly, he just didn't want the hassle from these people. Didn't want to hinder building up the body of Christ there. So he says, did I commit sin in humbling myself? No, because I preached it to you free of charge, and that's a good translation. I think the King James says freely, but that word there in the Greek means gratis, or without payment, a gift, free of charge. And then he uses this, it's a strong word. This word for robbed borders on the sense of looted or sacked. Did I sack or loot other churches? Metaphorically speaking, I took money from them. And you know what? These churches might have had some justification for complaint, but you don't. I favored you over this in this particular situation. And the very thing you're accusing me of, I did for your benefit. Robbed other churches, taking wages. And again, wages is not to be understood literally. They were wages in the sense they were for his livelihood. But that did not turn him into some kind of, and we need to be careful here, because there's a difference, right? In John chapter 10, verse 12, Jesus talks about who with the sheep? He was different from what? A hireling who does it only for what? Money. So what happens when something really important or dangerous comes along? I'm not so interested in sticking my neck out for these sheep, right? Paul was not like that. And so, the fact of the matter is, and we've talked about this issue before, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but preachers are entitled to be paid, and they're entitled to be paid a living wage or salary. We shouldn't expect them to live in poverty. On the other hand, obviously, evangelists need to be interested in more than just a paycheck, right? They need to be interested in, the good of the church, of where they're working, or the work in which they're engaged. And so, it's interesting, of course, for Paul, early on while he was there, he was with Aquila and Priscilla because they were what? When he was in Corinth, what were they doing to support themselves? They were making tents, right? And it's interesting, and we talked about this before back, if you recall, I don't know how long it's been, when we went through the book of Acts 2 or 3 years ago. We go to Acts 18, and we mentioned this at the time. But notice verse 3, because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for by occupation they were tent makers. But now notice verse 5. When Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, right, Philippi, Paul was compelled by the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. That Greek phrase there, compelled by the Spirit, doesn't really come through in our English Bibles, but literally what it means is, we discussed this when we looked at Acts, when Silas and Timothy showed up, they had what with them? What did they have with them that they brought from the Macedonians? Yeah, they had money. They had money for Paul's support, which allowed Paul to do what? That's really what this verse means. What did that allow Paul to do? He went full time into preaching and teaching and evangelizing. He quit making tents at that point. That's what the verse means in Acts chapter 18, verse 5. And so he says here, and this harkens back to that verse, when I was present with you and in need, I was a burden to no one. He took care of his own stuff, made tents. For what I lacked, though, the brethren who came from Macedonia supplied. And in everything I kept myself from being burdensome to you, and so I will keep myself. And that was his intent, and he said, that's what I'm going to continue doing. I don't want to compromise my work here. And then it's interesting, and people again misunderstand the whole Bible teaching on oaths because they don't understand the context that Jesus was talking about. Don't swear by this or that. Knowing that in that day and age, the Jewish leaders had come up with this system about, you had to, it didn't matter if you told the truth unless you used a certain oath, and then you had to tell the truth. That's the context of that. In every other place in the New Testament, what does it say about oaths? There's nothing wrong with oaths. Paul takes 2 of them here in this context. In fact, Hebrews said God swore by himself. So there's nothing wrong with going into court and saying, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. You don't have to say I affirm, which is frankly the same thing. But notice what Paul says here. He says he takes an oath. As the truth of Christ is in me. That's an oath. No one shall stop me from this boasting in the regions of Achaia. Okay? This is not open to negotiation. And I'm calling upon God to testify that my words are true. And so you have to keep it in context from Matthew chapter 5. No one shall stop me from this boasting in the regions. Why? Because I do not love you? Rhetorical question, of course. What does he say then? Another oath. because I do not love you? God knows. Again, he brings God in as his witness about how much he loves these people in Corinth and why he was doing this. And so, let's begin the next section, verse 12. But what I do, I will also continue to do, that I may cut off the opportunity from those who desire an opportunity to be regarded just as we are in the things of which they boast. For such are false apostles. Now, that's an interesting word. What's the Greek word for apostle? Everybody knows that, right? Apostolos. What's the Greek word for false? We use these words all the time in English. Pseudo. This is a compound word. Pseudo-apostolos. These are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for Satan himself transforms himself into an angel of light. Therefore it is no great thing if his ministers also transform themselves into ministers of righteousness, whose end will be according to their works. Well, why are you doing this, Paul? I'm cutting off an opportunity from those who desire an opportunity. What do you mean? Well, how would you know the difference between Paul and these fellows? You know it by the motivation, right? Do you think, what would happen if these same guys, if the same fellows wanted to imitate Paul and say, well, we're not going to take, or what if the Corinthians said, well, we're not going to pay y'all? What do you think they would have done? Yeah, they'd have lost interest all of a sudden in the Corinthians, right? And so if they chose to imitate Paul and forfeit financial support, they'd lose interest. But if they accept money, which they are, they're admitting that their relationship with the church in Corinth is different from Paul's. It's not the same relationship. It's not as genuine as Paul's is. He's exposing their supposed disinterest in monetary gain, and he's showing that his motivation is different from theirs. That I may cut off the opportunity from those who desire an opportunity to be, they want to be regarded just as me. Well, if they want to be regarded like Paul, then what should they do? Well, we won't take it either, right? But they're not going to do that. So now he gets pretty frank here with these people. For such are false apostles, notice his descriptions, deceitful workers, transforming. Now let's talk about this word because I think this is important. When you go into Romans chapter 12, verse 2, or you go back in chapter 3 of this book, that word transform is what Greek word? Anybody remember? We sometimes talk about it with butterflies, caterpillars and butterflies. What do? It's metamorphosis. Metamorpho is the Greek word from which we get our word metamorphosis. And that word is used in a positive sense. In the fact that when we become Christians, we change and become something that we weren't before. There's a change in our nature, really. It's deep in our thinking. But this word is not the same word, even though the New King James uses the word transform. Some modern versions use some different words, which I like. I think the New American Standard uses the word disguise. The NIV uses the word masquerade. The word here actually means a change in appearance. Now, when a caterpillar changes into a butterfly, does he just change his appearance? No, he's a different creature. When you become a Christian, you're what? You're a new creature. When Paul said in Romans, be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, he's talking about some significant, deeper change. But here, these people aren't really changing. They're what? They're disguising themselves. They're masquerading. And we know what those words mean. You've been to a masquerade party. You wear something over your face. But you're no different underneath, are you? And so I think that is important here in the way he uses these words. Jesus actually brings real change, real transformation in the lives of his people. Observable changes. That's different from what these guys were doing. Transforming, disguising themselves into apostles of Christ. And no wonder for Satan himself. Does Satan transform? Does he become somebody different? No. He masquerades, he disguises himself. And therefore it's no great thing if his ministers, guess what? Satan has some deacons. There's that word. His ministers, his servants, also disguise, masquerade as ministers of righteousness. You know, we're told to, you read 1 Corinthians 13, and you start talking about the various traits of love. We as Christians are to be a trusting people. We're to believe the best in other people, right? And so when somebody comes in looking like a minister of righteousness, you want to give them the benefit of the doubt, so to speak. But at some point, that's not an excuse for gullibility. And at some point, what they teach and what they practice has to be compared to what? Yeah, absolutely. Their teachings and their works have to be compared to God's Word. And when they don't measure up, then we, have to step back and say, now, wait a minute. Maybe they're not who they say they are. And so, whether or not we catch them all while we're here in this world, there's one thing for certain according to this last phrase. Whose end will be what? According to their works. And that's true for everybody. Christian and non-Christian alike. People get away with a lot of stuff. Can get away with a lot of stuff. But nobody ultimately gets away with anything. Or will, yeah.
One of the great responsibilities for B.J. Clark as the director of the school and the other teachers is that men show up here disguised with false intentions, and they want to be sent out by the Memphis School of Preaching as a graduate from the Memphis, but they know what to say, they know how to get an A on their test, they learn the doctrine, and their whole purpose is to go to a church after they graduate and take over and divide and split, and they're not sound, and they find out. They think they can disguise themselves, but after about a year, they start talking, and you start seeing what they're all about, and it's a very weighty thing on B.J. Clark. He has to be a shepherd, wise, looking at these men. And for all the years we've had in school, it almost every class you have to watch for this. And it's a very real thing today. It's very real.
Yeah, I mean, two things can happen. One, sometimes a person can come through the school who maybe not as spiritually mature as we'd like for him to be, and so he goes out and runs into some other people and gets taken in and into some, false doctrine, and it happens. But occasionally you do get a few that come through. Maybe, I don't know about every year, but there have been some that have come through who, were not honest up front. And that does occasionally happen. So yeah, I mean, you have to, you try to be as, you want to believe the best intentions in people, obviously. But, you have to kind of, you have to keep that one eye open all the time. And that certainly was the way it was with these fellows in Corinth. So that gets us to verse 16, which, beginning in verse 16, he, in defending himself and his ministry, he goes in a couple of more directions. One, we're going to see, he talks about his sufferings. In other words, once we look and see what all Paul's been through, could these fellows in Corinth really say that they had been through what Paul had been through for the gospel of Christ? And the answer obviously was no. That's number one. And then he's going to talk about revelations and visions he received and the signs that he could work. Question, did these fellows have what Paul did when it came to revelations and visions and signs? And the answer again is no. And so he again is going to be showing evidences of his authority and his apostleship and of his character. But it's interesting, this Paul, I don't know how to say it, he can't stand having to do this. I mean, Paul would rather have a well-reasoned, level-headed conversation with people and not refuting personal attacks, and then having to talk. Basically, Paul's going to have to talk about himself. And most people, to their credit, I think, are uncomfortable. Not everybody. But I think if you're a normal person, you're a little uncomfortable just talking about yourself. And when you're a humble person like Paul, it's just terrifying to have to talk about yourself. It just, you don't want to have to think about, oh, well, now I got to boast. I got, tell all these people what I've done. And yet this situation had placed him in this position. And the thing about it is, he couldn't resort to their tactics. He would be unchristlike. If he didn't debate with them, they would say, well, you can't answer our accusations. And also, for him not to do anything would invite disaster upon this church. And so the Holy Spirit says, look, Paul, it's time for you to lay out your credentials. Whether you like it or not, this is what we're going to do. Let's think about it. Who did Paul want to imitate more than anyone else in his life? Well, how much time did Christ spend going around talking about himself in the sense of boasting about himself? How much time did Jesus spend doing that? None. It was all about other people. And so that's what he's going to say here. And this is sometimes called, his fool's speech, because that's what he calls it. And so that's what we're going to have here beginning in verse 16 and really on into the next chapter, about halfway through chapter 12, his so-called fool's speech. He says, I say again, let no one think me a fool. This word for fool here in the Greek literally means want of mental sanity and sobriety, a reckless and inconsiderate habit of mind. Basically says, this is insane. I'm insane for having to speak this way. If otherwise, at least receive me as a fool, that I may also boast a little. Here's the thing, Corinthians. You've put up with these other fellows. You can put up with me for a little bit after all I've done for you. It's embarrassing. But these people have attempted to compare their ministry to mine. And so now I'm going to follow the advice of Proverbs 26:4 and do what? I'm going to answer a fool according to his what? His folly. What I speak not according to the Lord. Now notice what he says, but as it were foolishly in this confidence of boasting. Now I know Jesus didn't behave this way. That's not what he would do, but here I am, and here we go. This has been forced upon me. I'm not talking as the Lord would, but as a fool. And you know, neither Jesus nor Paul really worried about what the public thought about them in general. Fame was not their purpose. And that's what politicians and other famous people, whether they're singers or actors or whatever, you want to be famous, you have to be concerned about what? But you have to be concerned about what? Everybody here thinks about you, because if you start doing things that the public doesn't like, even if it's right, well, they'll quit following you on whatever, X or whatever it's called now, right? And they'll quit buying your movies and your albums, and they'll quit voting you into office. But neither Jesus nor Paul were worried about that. In fact, it's always been interesting to me how many times Jesus would heal somebody and then tell them what? Don't tell anybody. And so Paul says, look, I'm not following his example when I do this, but we're going to do it. Seeing that many boast according to the flesh, I will also boast. You know, these Corinthians, they were impressed. What do you think that more than likely these guys were boasting of? If they were Judaizing teachers, they were probably boasting of things like, well, where did they probably come from? Huh? Yeah, they probably came from the great what? First church ever established. You know, we're connected. You know, we came from Jerusalem. You know, we know all the big folks in the brotherhood. You know, we hobnob and we rub elbows with brother so-and-so. Remember, they brought letters of commendation, supposedly of some sort. Paul said, you're my letter of commendation. And so, according to the flesh, self-praise, it's kind of funny. Paul's like saying, you know, it seems to me that self-praise is the only way to get your attention, Corinthians. So, you know, I guess I'll go through all this. But they're boasting about external advantages and privileges, nationality, birth, position. Really nothing to do with what? What really makes somebody something in this world? It has, and it's not participation trophies. And it's not who you're connected to. It's merit. What have you done? You know, what have you done? So, Paul says, well, I guess I'll meet them on their own ground. I will also boast. For you put up with fools gladly, since you yourselves are wise. You've been taken in. For you put up with it. You bear with it. You put up with it as if one brings you into bondage, if one devours you, if one takes from you, if one exalts himself, if one strikes you on the face. You know what this reminds me of? I can't help but think of, I don't know what they call it. I call it battered women's syndrome. But what happens a lot of times with these women that are mistreated by these men? Somebody tries to help them out, get them out of the situation. What do? They go right back. For whatever reason, there's something in their psyche. They're lacking in self-esteem, whatever it is. Maybe they think they deserve it. But for whatever reason, their connection is they go back just to be mistreated by the same fella. Paul says, that's you, Corinthians. You put up with, one brings you into bondage, devours you, takes from you, exalts himself, and strikes you on the face. Not literally, obviously. But these guys are taking advantage of you and you tolerate it. Exercise lordship over you. Strut around as if there's something. You submit to whatever demands they make. You know, you get from this that Paul is clearly irritated. I mean, he basically says, look, if you can put up with that, you can listen to me for a little bit. All I've ever done is try to do what's best for you. To our shame, I say that we were too weak for that. But in whatever anyone is bold, I speak foolishly, I am bold also. To our disgrace, to our dishonor. He's not talking about inward shame. What he's talking about, these people basically had dishonored him. These Corinthians, they were dishonoring Paul. He said, I'm sorry for not behaving the way these guys are behaving. I've been too weak to abuse you or take advantage of you. You know, you probably can't, Paul's probably sitting there wondering, I wonder if they'd like me better if I mistreated them like these guys. Maybe I should have slapped them around a little bit, metaphorically speaking. Treated them poorly. Sometimes unfortunately, it's not unusual to find people that are willing to criticize those who have the most selfless spirit. But it appears that for whatever reason, there's plenty of people in Corinth that are only going to be impressed with boasting. And so, assuming that everything they say is true, Paul's just going to say, look, they don't compare to me. I'll tell you what you get when you read this next section is you really find out how little we know of what Paul went through in his life. Because if you think about it, now this book if it was written, let's say 7 or 8 years before his Roman imprisonment, or even his second imprisonment, or his first one, then when you read this list, don't include some of those things that happened later in Acts. Sometimes we think, I shipwrecked a night in the deep. Well, they must be talking about what? Acts 26? No, this book was written before then. So there's a lot of stuff in here that, there are some things in Acts you could pick out and say, yeah, he was stoned. We know he was stoned in Lystra or wherever it was. But there's a lot of things in here we don't know when it happened, where it happened. But he went through a lot. So he starts out with his pedigree, like these fellas. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. And these words could be used, I suppose, interchangeably. There's not a lot of distinction, but sometimes there can be. It could be when he says, I'm a Hebrew, unlike these fellows, he says, I'm comfortable speaking what? Go back to Acts chapter 2. When all those Jews were gathered from around the Roman Empire, why did the apostles have to speak in all those different languages? I mean, they're talking to Jews. Right, even though they were Jews, they had grown up in other parts of the Roman, they were part of the diaspora, they had grown up in parts of the world, so they spoke Greek or whatever. They didn't speak Aramaic or Hebrew. You remember what they did when they were getting ready to take Paul into Antonia, into the fortress there in Jerusalem? And he's on the steps and he speaks to them in what? Aramaic. And they all stopped. Paul says, look, I can speak the language. Maybe that's what he means there. Of course, Israelite carries strong ethnic and national connotations, suggesting, of course, the people who worship the true God, descendants of Jacob. He starts talking about descendants of Abraham. You know what? Abraham had other descendants, right? Besides, he had Ishmael, right? And just because you were a descendant of Jacob, well, you could have been a descendant of who? If you came through Jacob. Esau. So, these things are important. So obviously these guys were Judaizers of some sense, or he wouldn't be saying these things. Well, he's not arguing whether or not they're genuine. He just assumes it for the sake of argument. Verse 23. Are they ministers, servants of Christ? I speak as a fool, I am more. Fool, that's that word insane again. I'm speaking like I'm insane. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequently, in deaths often. From the Jews, 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods, once I was stoned, 3 times I was shipwrecked, a night and a day I've been in the deep, in journeys often, we'll talk about that, in perils of water. Perils means what? Danger, right? Perils of water, robbers, own countrymen, Gentiles, in the city, in the wilderness, in the sea, among false brethren, in weariness and toil, in sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. That word for nakedness means he just doesn't have the proper clothes. He's not totally naked. He doesn't have the right clothes for the season. He's cold. He's wet. Besides the other things, what comes upon me daily, my deep concern for all the churches. Who is weak, and I am not weak? Who is made to stumble, and I do not burn with indignation? Again, we see some of these things in Acts, but there's a lot of these things that we don't. Why would he have only received, and we'll end here, why would he have only received 39 stripes? You remember the law of Moses, Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 1 through 3, said you couldn't give a man more than 40. Well, you didn't want to lose count, give more than 40. Well, it had nothing to do with mercy, by the way. But the one giving them didn't want to lose count, so what would they do? Well, we'll limit it to 39 just in case. And Josephus mentions this twice in his writings as well. All right, we'll pick up there next week.